I'm Dr. Stephen M. Stahl, Professor of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, Honorary Visiting Senior Fellow at the University of Cambridge, and the Director of Psychopharmacology for the California Department of State Hospitals. Joining me here today is Dr. Richard Jackson, Diplomate of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at the Wayne State University School of Medicine, and Assistant Clinical Adjunct Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan Medical School.
Today we'll be taking a closer look at the dopamine receptor blocking agents which we encounter in psychiatry. While the use of antipsychotic medications has greatly improved the quality of life for patients, they are also known to increase the risk for drug-induced movement disorders, including tardive dyskinesia, known as TD.
Sounds like an interesting discussion. Perhaps a good place to begin would be to take a look at the medications which are known to have effects on movement and how the utilization of these medications has expanded over time. The primary dopamine receptor blocking agents in psychiatry are antipsychotics, which were first introduced in the 1950s. These were the first generation antipsychotics. At that time, there were about 0.4 to 1 million people with schizophrenia in the U.S. who were potentially exposed to first-generation antipsychotics. In the 1990s, second-generation antipsychotics were developed and were rapidly adopted for the treatment of schizophrenia. By 1996, 39% of patients with schizophrenia received second-generation antipsychotics, compared to 64% receiving first-generation antipsychotics. During that time, about 0.7 to 1.8 million people with schizophrenia were living in the U.S. and potentially exposed to antipsychotics. In the early 2000s, some second-generation antipsychotics gained indications for affective disorders. For example, olanzapine, risperidone, ziprasidone, and quetiapine fumarate were approved by the FDA for the treatment of bipolar disorder between 2000 and 2004. Later, other second-generation antipsychotics, including aripiprazole, quetiapine fumarate extended release, olanzapine, and brexpiprazole, were approved by the FDA for the treatment of major depressive disorder, or MDD. When you consider the number of individuals living in the U.S. with either schizophrenia or affective disorders in the 2000s, the number of people potentially exposed to antipsychotics increased to 32 million. In recent years, indications for pediatric, adolescent, and long-term maintenance were added to some second-generation antipsychotics. These expanded indications further increase the number of people potentially exposed to antipsychotics who may be at risk for developing drug-induced movement disorders.
It is interesting to see the dramatic increase in the number of people who can potentially be exposed to dopamine receptor blocking agents in the past 2 decades. Between 1998 and 2008, the use of second-generation antipsychotics increased by 78%. This expansion can be attributed to the approval of antipsychotics for the treatment of affective disorders by the FDA.
Did you know that a recent study showed that 1 out of every 5 people diagnosed with depression was prescribed an antipsychotic within a year?
Yes, and it's not just depression. Between 2007 and 2008, the lion's share of antipsychotics were prescribed for the treatment of bipolar disorder, depression, and other conditions. Less than a quarter of the antipsychotic prescriptions were for schizophrenia. In fact, the annual prescription of antipsychotics in the U.S. is estimated at 3.1 million. However, antipsychotics are not the only dopamine receptor blocking agents. Others, such as metoclopramide, are indicated as antiemetics and drive the potential population of people receiving dopamine receptor blocking agents even higher. An additional 2 million people are prescribed metoclopramide each year. This means that more than 5 million people are exposed to dopamine receptor blocking agents in the U.S. every year. Therefore, it is critical that drug-induced movement disorders are assessed in individuals receiving dopamine receptor blocking agents.
Let's summarize what we discussed. These expanded indications further increase the number of people potentially exposed to antipsychotics who may be at risk for developing drug-induced movement disorders. Between 2007 and 2008, the lion's share of antipsychotics were prescribed for the treatment of bipolar disorder, depression, and other conditions. More than 5 million people are exposed to dopamine receptor blocking agents in the U.S. every year.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion as much as we did. Thank you for listening.